So today I'm going to try something that I have never done before and always wanted to do. I'm going to try to build my very own bass cab. Now this is something that you guys have been requesting ever since my video on how to build your own guitar cab, and I've kind of been put off by the project because, let's be honest, there's a lot of really good reasons why you shouldn't attempt to build your own bass cab, and we'll cover those a little bit later in this video as I'm building it. But I did think of two really good reasons why I should try. One, to see if I can do it, and two, to see if I could do it for cheaper than I could buy a new bass cab. Now, overall cost of the project is probably reason number one why you shouldn't try to build your own bass cab. So to help offset the cost, I went to Home Depot and I found a heavily discounted piece of 3/4 inch MDF. And I went ahead and had them cut it down to some dimensions for me in the store just so I could transport the sheet easier. So now that we're prepped and ready, let's go ahead and start cutting this thing up and see if we can't build a decent sounding bass guitar cab. So let's go ahead and talk about some more reasons why you shouldn't try to build your own bass guitar cab. Reason number two is the construction. Unlike building a guitar cab, you can't just pick your dimensions, pick your speaker, pick your wood, and build something, and it'll more than likely sound pretty awesome. With bass frequencies, however, it's a lot less forgiving. You don't get nearly as much creative liberty. Bass frequencies require a lot of math, a lot of calculations, and a lifetime of learning to get it right. So really, it's not very practical for you to try to draw up your own design. So to circumvent that problem, I am building somebody else's design. Somebody else put in the hard work of the calculations required to get optimal bass frequencies out of a box. Now, there's a surprising lack of information on the internet on how to build your own bass guitar cab. But there is tons and tons of information about how to build your own car audio subwoofer box. And as far as I know, the difference between the two is really not that much. So for my design, I used a website called subbox.pro, and I basically just copied a popular car audio subwoofer design, but I was able to adjust some of the dimensions so that I could tune it properly for this speaker. So let's go ahead and have a look inside. As you can see here, this is a vented enclosure. It's not the same as a sealed enclosure. A sealed enclosure would actually be a little bit more forgiving. As long as your internal volume, it pretty much matches what your speaker was designed for, you should be fine. But the reason why I went with a vented enclosure is because you can actually extend the low end frequencies a little bit by using an enclosure like this. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding of vented or ported enclosures is that as your speaker vibrates and moves air, you have frequencies going forward and frequencies going backwards. And in a sealed enclosure, those frequencies are confined, whereas in a vented or a ported enclosure, those frequencies come out a different part of the box. In this case, it has to travel through this little rat maze, and then it's redirected back out the front. So as the wavelength develops, you have another wavelength going this way that has to travel back through this rat maze and meet back up, and if the box is properly tuned, your lower end frequencies will line up with the sound wave and you'll get double the volume. The problem is, if your cabinet is not properly tuned, then what you can have is an opposite effect, and your waves will come out in an opposite wavelength, and you'll get phase cancellation, which will actually lower the low end. So what we're trying to do here is we're trying to get double the low end frequencies. And if we do have any phase cancellation, we're hoping that that's going to be more in the mid-range, because bass cabs typically you want a lot of lows and a lot of what I call high mids, that 1 to 2K frequency range, and that's what's going to make our bass cab sound the best. So now I picked this specific design from Subbox.pro because this box is tuned to the same frequency as the speaker, about 35 or 36 hertz. So in theory, by putting a full range speaker into a subwoofer box, I will get that awesome low end that I need, as well as the mids and highs that I will need. Now, if you know a lot more about this than I do, feel free to correct me in the comments. But the reason why I went ahead and attempted this anyway, because like I said, it could be a fail. I could get cancellation on the lows and this thing could sound like utter trash. But the reason why I decided to go ahead and go for it is because worst case scenario, I take this speaker out and put it in a different bass cab, and then I put a subwoofer in here, and then I have an epic proven subwoofer box. And now that I've done my test fit, and I know that this thing fits together just fine, it's time to glue this thing up. So to glue it up, because I made a lot of these cuts with a circular saw, it's not nearly as accurate as a table saw. I have some little gaps that are going to need filled, okay? We need this thing to be airtight. We want to make sure that all that air inside that's harnessing those bass frequencies doesn't escape through the seams and cracks. We want it to come out that vent so that we can get that double power, hopefully. So to seal up all the tiny little gaps and cracks that could possibly be made by my inaccurate cuts with a circular saw, instead of using Type Bond, I'm actually going to use a construction adhesive. I'm going to use extra strength Gorilla brand construction adhesive, and I'm using that just because I have it left over from a previous project. But liquid nails, I've heard, can get good results as well. Also, as we're gluing it up, I'm going to be installing polyfill. Now, polyfill is an important part of bass enclosures or high fidelity speakers or subwoofers. And the theory behind using polyfill is, one, that it'll dampen some of the reverberations happening inside here. And two, it'll vibrate as the air moves, creating friction and thereby warming up the air. Now, there's debate on the internet whether or not this is actually a true thing, but people do say that adding polyfill to a bass enclosure will make it sound like it's a bigger enclosure than it actually is, because as the air vibrates and warms up, in theory, it's less dense. So less dense air, the frequencies would pass through as though the enclosure were much bigger than it actually is. One step that I'm skipping in this construction is adding bracing, and that's another important part of bass cab building construction, especially for large, powerful cabs. Now, this is not a large, powerful cab, and that's the reason why I'm skipping it. It's a fairly small cab with a fairly small speaker. You know, it's just a 1x10. So I didn't feel like the bracing was required since I was using 3/4 inch MDF, which is already really stiff. Not to mention that these extra walls for the vent actually add structural bracing as well. So I just don't see these speaker walls flexing quite a bit. I could be wrong about that. Again, correct me in the comments if you know more than I do about this. gotta say, I am pretty friggin' smitten with this bass cab. It sounds so much better than I expected it to. Honestly, did not expect it to sound very good, but it does sound good with active pickups, passive pickups, rounds, flats, even a fretless piezo bass. It just sounds awesome. Way better than I expected. Typically, when you do something like this your first try, you're just learning a bunch of lessons. And I did learn a few lessons along the way. One being, and this is something that I sort of expected from this bass cab, is that because I based it off of a car audio subwoofer, I did that because I wanted that extended low range, those really deep gut rumbling frequencies. And I sort of traded that for efficiency. So it's not a very efficient bass cab. It doesn't get very loud. This is only a 25 watt tube amp and it overpowers this thing pretty quickly. So this is kind of a bedroom level practice and recording bass cab. It's not really a gigging bass cab. Now, another thing that I learned is that I actually have enough materials left over to build another one just like it, assuming I want to invest in another speaker and some more of these cool amp corners. These are stackable, by the way, so if I built another one, it would stack and these would lock right in. That's a pretty cool feature. For maybe another $100, I could have two matching cabs, and then I could run them in parallel at 4 ohms, and that would probably actually get this up to a giggable volume. But yeah, like I mentioned earlier in the video, it's not really cost effective to build your own bass cab, okay? I made this fairly inexpensive because I bought a used speaker, I bought discounted wood, I bought the cheapest, hardware and speaker grill that I could find, and I used my own construction adhesive, screws and stuff like that. So I pretty much saved money at every corner. And overall, I still have about $150 invested in this design. You're kind of best off just buying used speaker cabs. I mean, I see used speaker cabs for $150 all the time on Facebook Marketplace and Craigslist. So while it's super cool, and I probably will build another one because I have the materials to, I don't know that it's super practical. But you guys let me know in the comments if you think that it is. And if you want to know what bass amp this is, you're gonna have to make sure you're subscribed and click that bell notification, because this is a really cool do-it-yourself tube amp kit based loosely off of the Ampeg Portaflex. So I'm gonna be reviewing that next week. So make sure you're subscribed. I'm Dan, this is Guns and Guitars. See you in that next video.